All right, so today I want to introduce, we have Dr. Roger Baldwin. He's a cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology, Davis, and he specializes in human-wildlife conflict resolution. And today he's going to be speaking on managing voles, rats, and mice in agricultural fields. So I'm going to pass this over to Roger.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started today. As Cheryl indicated, I am going to be talking about how we manage voles, rats, and mice, particularly in agricultural systems. So we thought we'd start off with a little bit of background information into the species that I'll be talking about today. One of the ones that I'm going to be talking about is the vole, or the meadow vole, is sometimes referred to as meadow mice as well. So if you're more familiar with that term, we're talking about the same thing here. Voles are usually dark grayish brown in color and about 4 to 6 inches in length. So size-wise, they're actually a little bit larger than your typical house mouse or deer mouse, but they're definitely smaller than a roof rat or Norway rat, which we'll be talking about today as well. One of the really challenging aspects about voles is that their populations do tend to cycle quite a bit. And so you can have relatively low numbers of voles in a particular area. In fact, you may not even know that they're present. And then all of a sudden, when conditions get right, those populations can really explode in a matter of just a few months. And it can literally feel like you are being overrun by voles in those kinds of settings. And so it can be a very challenging situation to deal with when you're dealing with one of those real population explosions in voles. Now, voles do live in open burrow systems, and the openings to their burrow systems are usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in diameter. You oftentimes see runways, such as what we see here in the bottom right photo, running back and forth, connecting those burrow entrances. And this is a really good diagnostic tool to allow you to know whether or not you have voles present in an area versus some other kind of rodent species. It can be important to discern whether or not those burrow systems are active. And so you can look at those runways and look for fresh fecal pellets or grass clippings around those entrances. And that can be a good way to let you know if those burrow systems are currently in use. And as far as damage is concerned, if we're talking about tree or vine crops, they like to girdle the stems of young trees or vines, which can be a very costly form of damage if you have to go out and replace those trees or vines. In other crops, they directly consume vegetation, and then they gnaw on cables, pipes, any kind of irrigation tubing, things along those lines can all be problematic. We're going to be talking about rats and mice today, starting off with rats. There's 2 primary rat species that I'm going to be covering today, and those are Norway rats and roof rats. These are commensal rodents, which means they typically live in concert with humans, and so they're very common in and around urban dwellings, even rural farms and places like that. That said, they also can be found out in agricultural fields as well. Roof rats are probably found more in ag fields than Norway rats are, but we can find Norway rats out in certain types of ag fields as well. As far as diagnostics, to differentiate between them, Norway rats tend to be a little bit larger. They have a shorter tail, which is an important characteristic. They usually have a blunter nose and smaller ears. And here you can see the reverse of that in the roof rat. Roof rats also tend to be more arboreal, which means they climb really well. So they'll get up into trees, but they'll also get up into attics and places like that. Climbing is less commonly observed with the Norway rat. They tend to spend more time down on the ground. Certainly roof rats spend time on the ground as well, though, so don't think that they're only up at elevated locations. Thought we could go through a nice little video here to kind of showcase how you might tell if this particular critter here is a roof rat versus a Norway rat. If you look at the tail right there, you see the tail is quite long. In fact, it is longer than the length of the body of the rat. And so if you see a tail of that length, you have a roof rat. Norway rat tails tend to be shorter than the entire length of the body. And we're also going to talk about mice today as well, in particular two mouse species. Those are the house mouse and the deer mouse. The top photo is an example of a house mouse, and a house mouse is another example of a commensal rodent, again, adjusted to living in concert with humans. Incidentally, roof rats, Norway rats, and house mice are all non-native species. We would consider them to be invasive species here in California and throughout North America. So in addition to being pests, they're really critters that we don't want here anyways. We prefer to have the native rodent species, and in many cases, these non-native rodent species outcompete our native rodent species. As far as differentiating between the two, the house mouse tends to be more brown or grayish brown all over. They have smaller eyes and ears when compared to deer mice. Their tail tends to be also pretty naked. They don't have a lot of hair on those tails. Contrast that with the deer mouse, the larger eyes, the larger ears. They're bicolored, meaning they're brown or grayish brown on top and white underneath. The tail also exhibits that bicolored nature, brown on the top, white underneath, and they have a lot of hair on their tail. So it's usually pretty easy to tell the difference between a house mouse and a deer mouse. Now for damage, oftentimes they feed directly on the crop themselves. Excuse me, roof rats are a common pest in citrus, and in fact, this is a larger project that I've been involved with over the last few years, trying to more effectively manage roof rats in citrus. And some of the damage that we see in citrus, particularly with oranges, they oftentimes create a small hole into the orange and then hollow it out. In other words, they eat all the fruit inside, but leave most of the rind. Interestingly, they do the exact opposite with Meyer lemons. They'll eat the rind, but leave the fruit. And in fact, you can actually see the whole fruit hanging on the tree without the rind. So it's an interesting situation. As far as other crops, almonds, this is a great example of almonds that have been chewed on by deer mice. Roof rats cause fairly similar damage in almonds and other nut crops as well. So this kind of direct consumption of the crop itself can certainly be concerning and can result at least in some loss in production. But really the bigger concern, particularly when it comes to roof rats, is the kind of girdling damage that they can do. This is an example on a lemon tree where they've girdled this particular branch. And if the girdling goes all the way around the branch, it can lead to mortality of that branch. And we do see fairly substantial losses in some orchards from this kind of girdling activity. And, keep in mind when you have this kind of girdling activity, you're losing not just the fruit on that particular branch that particular year, but for the lifetime of that tree. And so this can be a particularly costly form of damage. And of course, they also chew on irrigation tubing, and they can be pose a food safety risk in agricultural fields as well. All right, so at this point, we're going to start talking about some of the different control strategies that we have for managing these particular species. And when it comes to managing roof rats, Norway rats, house mice, deer mice, voles, etc., what we want to focus on is the use of an integrated approach. And with an integrated approach, of course, what we're talking about is utilizing multiple strategies. We generally find better results if we use multiple strategies than if we were to rely on any single one approach. And for all of these different critters, there are different strategies that could potentially be used in a management program. Here we have a couple of examples of something that could be used for roof rats. If you had extensive roof rat problems in a citrus orchard, maybe you'd start off with an elevated bait station utilizing a 0.005% diphacinone product to knock down the population, and then continue to try to maintain low densities of roof rats for a longer period of time using snap traps. In this case, we have snap traps inside this tube to exclude non-target access to the snap traps. But there are certainly other tools that could be used. The important point to remember is that mixing and matching those tools is going to give you better results, because not all individuals in a population are going to be equally susceptible to every tool that you utilize. And if you focus on just one tool, you're going to always miss a certain segment of that population out there. So mixing and matching tools is really important. With that, we're gonna, like I said, get into some of the different tools that are out there for managing voles, rats, and mice. And this chart is meant to give you an idea of what some of the different tools are for managing these particular species. When you look at this chart, you'll notice that there are some tools that can be used for both groups that we're talking about today, such as habitat modification and bait application, and we'll talk more about those. Burrow fumigants are not used very commonly for the species we're talking about today, more commonly used for ground squirrels and gophers, but there are some isolated situations where you might use them. And so we'll talk about that. Trapping is commonly used for rats and sometimes for mice in ag fields, less commonly used for voles, and we'll hit on that. Exclusion is a potential option for voles, not so much for rats and mice, at least when it comes to production ag fields. Repellents, there may be an option moving forward with voles. We'll hit on that. And then frightening and shooting devices, unfortunately, are just not practical tools for the species that we're talking about here today. Of course, this chart is by no means all inclusive. There are some other tools that could be used as well. One of those tools is biocontrol. With biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predators to help control pest populations. And when we talk about biocontrol, usually the animal that we end up talking about the most is the barn owl. The barn owl basically is the poster child of biocontrol. The reason why we oftentimes focus on barn owls as opposed to some other species is for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that we know barn owls do feed on a large number of rodents. In fact, some of the research has shown anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 rodents removed in an annual on an annual basis from one breeding pair of barn owls, and so they are very efficient predators of these kinds of rodent species. The other reason we oftentimes focus on barn owls is because they're a relatively non-territorial species. What that means is you can put up a number of barn owl boxes in a particular area and then hopefully get barn owls to utilize those boxes, thereby allowing you to artificially inflate barn owl densities in a given area so that hopefully they will then hunt in that particular area and can then ultimately reduce those rodent numbers. However, there is still some uncertainty as to how effective this approach can be. There's been a couple of small studies that have shown that putting up barn owl boxes in an area can result at least in somewhat lower gopher densities in a particular area. There really isn't much, particularly here in California, to show that they result in lower vole, mouse, or rat numbers. And we do have to keep in mind that these rodents do reproduce quite rapidly. Voles can have a number of litters per year, same thing with mice and rats as well. So the barn owls do have to eat a very substantial number of these rodents in order to dramatically reduce those population densities in a particular area. Based on some of the research that I've seen and some of the research that I've been involved with, it seems like the use of barn owls is probably most beneficial when you're dealing with already low densities of rodents. And so if you're dealing with a high density population, likely you're going to need other tools to reduce those numbers in a particular area. And then maybe barn owls might be able to maintain them at a relatively low density for an extended period of time. So, at a minimum, it doesn't hurt to have barn owl boxes up on the landscape. It's great to have that natural predation, and any help we can get can be a real benefit. But probably you just want to think about them as one part of an IPM program for managing rodents, and really I wouldn't rely exclusively on them to manage foreign rodent species. Another tool that we can use to manage rats, mice, and voles is habitat modification. And with habitat modification, we're talking about altering the desirability of an area for a particular pest species. There's lots of examples that we can provide for habitat modification. One of those tools is removal of brush piles. And so if we're dealing with an orchard crop, oftentimes we see brush or pruning piles either on the edge of those orchards or sometimes even interspersed within an orchard. And it's important to remember that these brush or pruning piles can provide really good harborage for a wide variety of rodent species and other wildlife species for that matter. And many of those species can cause damage in these cropping systems. Roof rats are a great example of a species that would love to utilize this kind of habitat and then move into the orchards where they could potentially cause damage. So getting rid of those brush or pruning piles can be a good step to help reduce some problems with those species. Another tool that really is probably more of a cultural practice, but we'll include it in the habitat modification section here today, is flood irrigation. I know that flood irrigation is more challenging these days because of the lack of water resources that we have here in the state. But there are still situations where flood irrigation is used. And if you're somebody who has the capability for flood irrigation and you have problems with bird rodents, in this case, probably primarily voles, although, taking it to another critter we're not talking about today, gophers as well. Both of those can be controlled pretty well through flood irrigation. And here you can see why that is. We've got a field that's flooded, causes those rodents to come up to the surface. And then you get all kinds of predatory species that come along and pick off those rodents. And so this can be a really good tool where it's possible to help try to manage some of these bird rodent species. And another great example for habitat modification pertains to voles. Voles are very cover dependent. If they don't have sufficient cover, they move out of that area. Otherwise, they would be too susceptible to predation. So if you're somebody who has vine or tree crops, you want to think about cover removal as a primary tool for helping to minimize damage from voles. When possible, keeping bare soil around the base of those trees or vines is a really good strategy to help reduce potential girdling damage from those voles. And then, in between rows, if you have vegetation or cover crops, if you can keep that mowed low, like we see here on the right, that can also help reduce the cover availability for voles and the potential problems that you might have with voles. So keeping those mowed low is a really good strategy for helping to reduce potential problems with voles. We can also use exclusion for voles. One common tool that's used for tree crops or vine crops is tree or trunk protectors. These are usually hard plastic protectors that are placed around the base of newly planted trees or vines. Basically, what you're doing is trying to eliminate access to the trunk of that tree or vine to the voles. If you're going to utilize these kinds of trunk protectors, though, you do need to utilize them properly, which usually means burying them 4 to 6 inches below ground. If you just place them on the top of the surface of the soil, you can actually create a more ideal environment for voles. They can basically just crawl underneath that and up inside the structure, and now they have food and cover. Which creates an ideal situation for them. And so you can actually see more damage from voles if these trunk protectors are utilized improperly than if they weren't used at all. So again, if you're going to use them, make sure you use them properly and bury them. There are also some situations where you might consider fencing to keep voles out of particular areas. I've done some work in artichokes over in the Castroville area. And artichokes are somewhat of a seasonal crop where they mow them down to where it basically becomes a bare soil out there during the non-production period. And those voles then move out of those areas and into either adjacent crop fields or natural areas. Then as the artichokes grow back up, they move back out into those artichoke fields and cause problems. And so we found that putting some kind of fencing between those natural areas and the crop fields dramatically reduces that reinvasion rate to the point where if you do constant monitoring in the fields, you can see when voles begin to reestablish themselves, target them at those low densities, and then you don't have that substantial problem throughout the growing season. So fencing can be a good structure or a good way to help reduce vole problems in some of those settings. If you're going to use fencing, it should be buried below ground, 6 inches at least, and it needs to extend above ground as well, maybe around 8 to 12 inches. Voles aren't really good climbers, but they can climb to some extent, so I wouldn't really focus on wire mesh. I like aluminum flashing because it lasts a long time and it's slick and the animals can't climb over it. But the growers oftentimes like to utilize this plastic mesh which is much cheaper, and they can put new mesh out every year. Just remember, you can't really fence off an entire field because you still have to move equipment in and out of those fields. But if you can utilize it in strategic locations, it can be a way to at least slow down potential reinvasion. Now, if you think back to the previous, like 2 slides ago, when we were looking at the trunk protectors on trees, you can envision how that would be an effective tool, but you can also envision how that would be a costly and time-consuming tool to put that on all the trees in a particular field. So what if we had another alternative that we could use to more or less deter the animals from girdling those trees? One of those tools that we oftentimes think about are repellents, in this case, chemical repellents. They usually rely on objectionable odors, unpleasant tastes, something that might elicit a fear, a fear response, such as predator urines, or maybe a pain response, such as capsaicin. All of these are different kinds of repellents that have been used for a variety of wildlife species, but they generally have not worked very well for rodents. However, there's another class of repellents as well, and those are post-ingestive repellents. Anthraquinone is an example of a post-ingestive product. What this is basically a product that the animal consumes a little bit of one time. They then get sick from consuming that product and learn to avoid it in the future. Anthraquinone was initially developed for use as a repellent for birds, but there's been some testing on it for mammal species as well, and we saw particularly good results in a lab setting with voles, where we had 84% repellency with anthraquinone. And so we got to thinking, well, what is a situation where we could potentially employ this in ag fields to reduce damage from voles? And the thing that came to mind immediately was tree or vine crops. Again, voles don't climb very well, but they like to girdle newly planted trees and vines. So if we could apply anthraquinone to the bottom 8 to 12 inches of newly planted trees or vines, then that could potentially protect those trees or vines from that kind of girdling damage. And so we set up a study to look at that as well. We looked at it during the summer and spring, basically corresponding to cool, wet, and hot, dry seasons. And what we saw was very promising. We saw anywhere from a 10 to 20-fold reduction in girdling damage for trees that were treated with anthraquinone versus those that were not treated. So this was really exciting news. We think that anthraquinone has real potential as a repellent for vole girdling damage moving forward. Unfortunately, it's still not a registered product. It is going through the registration process. And our hope is that here within the next year or two, maybe it will be available on the market. So keep your eye out for it. It's not a tool that's available yet, but we're hoping that it will be available in the future. Trapping is also another tool that's commonly used to help manage rats, mice, and voles. Let's start off talking about trapping as a potential tool for rats and mice. In agricultural fields, it's used more so for rats than mice because mice tend to be too numerous for trapping to be overly practical. So keep in mind that with some of the different traps that I'm going to talk about here for rats today, if you have a small scale mouse problem, you might be able to utilize some of these similar kinds of traps, although smaller versions, for managing mice as well. But for rats in particular, we can use snap traps and we can use live traps. Here's examples where we have traps elevated up in trees. We've placed them up in trees so that we don't have non-target species that live on the ground accessing these particular traps. That said, you can certainly utilize both of these traps on the ground and they will work well. Also, if you had Norway rat issues, you'd actually want them on the ground because they don't get up in the trees so much, but the roof rats do certainly get up in the trees. Here's just a couple of photos of how you might, or some of the successes that you might experience with these different kinds of traps. For the live traps, it is, the benefit is that when you capture the animal, it's kept alive in the trap, and that's beneficial if you're trapping in areas where you have concerns about potential non-target captures. So if you capture a non-target animal in a live trap, you can release it and it will be unharmed. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you're utilizing these live traps for roof rats and you do capture the roof rat in it, you are then responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. Sometimes people think that they can take live trapped animals somewhere else and release it, but you cannot. That is against California Fish and Game Code. So if you utilize these, you have to be prepared to euthanize the animal after capture. Of course, we need to do so in a humane manner. And there's really only one technique that's probably overly practical for use that's considered humane for roof rats, and that would be the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. With this particular device, you're basically taking the rat in the trap, putting it inside the device, and then pumping carbon dioxide into it at a specified flow rate, which will cause the animal to succumb or pass out to, or sorry, eventually pass out from exposure to the carbon dioxide and then eventually succumb to that exposure. The last thing I'll mention on euthanizing rats and live traps is that sometimes the live traps are sold with containers to drown the rats in. Drowning, however, is no longer considered a humane form of euthanasia. And more importantly, in California, it is actually illegal to euthanize animals via drowning. So keep that in mind. You can't use drowning as a tool to euthanize live trapped animals. Of course, in many cases, probably most cases, folks don't utilize live traps. Instead, they utilize snap traps. The problem with just putting regular snap traps out there on a tree without any kind of cover, though, is that non-target species can get caught in them. In particular, songbirds can commonly be caught in those kinds of traps. So we do oftentimes like to utilize one of these trapping containers, I guess you would call them, or trapping tunnel, that have the snap traps inside, and then the rat has to come inside and hit the trigger, and then they get caught. And so that eliminates access to a lot of those non-target species. And of course, if you're utilizing a snap trap like this, it kills the rat shortly after capture, so you don't have to euthanize it. Now, there's also a newer trap out there on the market called the Good Nature A24 trap. And what this is a multi-catch or repeating trap. And what happens with this particular trap is the rat comes along, it smells a long-lasting lure. This lure can actually last for 4 to 6 months. So the rat comes along, smells it, sticks its head inside, hits this trigger mechanism, which causes the trap to be activated. It's CO2 fired, so it releases CO2, which causes this bolt to be activated. It crushes the skull of the rat, kills it almost instantly, and then it retracts, and the rat falls out of the trap and is automatically reset. And you can get up to 24 captures per CO2 cartridge. So the fact that it's a long-lasting lure, combined with the fact that you can get 24 captures per trap, makes it pretty exciting. It's kind of a put out there and forget about it for an extended period of time type trap. And here we have a video of how this actually works. You've got a rat out in an orchard, smells the lure, crawls up inside, hits the trigger mechanism, it's activated, kills the trap pretty much instantly, or kills the rat pretty much instantly. It falls out and it's reset. So they sound great. And they do work well when they're activated. However, we've been testing them in citrus orchards, and we haven't been having a lot of success. And the problem seems to be that the rats just aren't going all the way up and into the trap. So we're continuing to look at it. They use them a lot in island conservation settings, and these traps have been successful in some situations with rats and less successful in other situations with rats. So just keep that in mind. They're out there. They're kind of a cool device. If we could get them to where they're consistently effective, I think they'd be a really great option. But at this point in time, they're a little bit hit or miss. Now, voles, trapping we use less commonly for voles. Voles are kind of like mice in that they're oftentimes too numerous for trapping to be an overly practical tool. That said, if you have a very small population of voles in an area, you could certainly catch them or manage them with trapping. They're not particularly difficult to catch in traps. One common strategy is to take a standard snap trap, place it perpendicular to a vole runway. Keep in mind, voles like to have those runways. And so if we place it perpendicular to that runway with a trigger mechanism over that runway, then when the vole runs up and back over that runway, it can get caught. And in fact, they really don't like to deviate off of these runways. And so we don't even need to put any kind of bait on it, which this is important because if we don't have bait on it, then it becomes much less attractive to any kind of non-target species. Again, thinking mostly about songbirds. And so we can use them without too much concern of catching songbirds in this capacity. Another strategy that I've seen employed was developed, or not developed, but described to me by Steve Albano, who sells a variety of different kinds of traps, and including this particular kind of trap, where they're basically using a couple of standard snap traps, just any kind of snap trap that's staked into the ground with a nail around the entrance of a vole burrow system. And then you take a piece of gutter pipe and place that over the top of those snap traps. Then when the vole runs out, it only has two directions to go, and both are directly over the trigger of a snap trap. And so that can be a good strategy to catch voles. But do keep in mind that if you're going to utilize this, you basically have to cover all the different entrances. If you forget one, the voles will just keep coming in and out of that particular opening. And so you do need to get all of them for this to work. But as I mentioned, vole populations tend to be pretty numerous. Here's an example of a bunch of burrow entrances in a really small area. And that really small area is just a small segment of a much larger area. So trying to trap something like this would take many, many people and thousands of snap traps. So it's just really not a practical tool over larger areas. So if we're dealing with larger areas, the strategy for managing voles in particular, but to some extent for rats and mice as well, is the use of baiting or rodenticide baits. In this case, we're talking about the use of poison or toxic baits to manage these species. There's a variety of different toxicants or active ingredients that are out there that could be used to manage a variety of different kinds of rodent species, but they're not all available for all of the different rodents that are out there. And so you always have to be very careful and read the labels of the products that you might potentially use before using them, so you know if they're allowable for use for a particular species and the scenarios in which they are allowable for use. So, for example, with voles, we can use first-generation anticoagulants and zinc phosphide. The example of first-generation anticoagulants that can be used would be warfarin, difascinone, and chlorphascinone. These are chronic feed materials, which basically means the animal needs to consume it over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. Then we also have zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxicant. This means it kills after a single feed, oftentimes within 24 hours. So those can be used for voles, whereas some of the other products like strychnine, bromethalin, and cholecalciferol cannot. Rats and mice get a little bit more complicated in that you can use both first generation and second generation anticoagulants, as well as bromethalin and cholecalciferol. However, when and where you use them is an important factor in deciding which one of these you can actually use. So if we're talking about commensal rodents, so Norway rats, roof rats, and house mice, in and around structures, then you can use bromethalin, you can use cholecalciferol, and in agricultural settings, in other words, around barns and dairies and places like that, you can use second generation anticoagulants. Second generation anticoagulants, though, they used to be used a lot in your commensal or urban or residential settings, but there's currently a moratorium on their use statewide, so they're no longer allowed for use with some special exemptions for it in those particular areas. So if you want to try to manage rats and mice in ag fields, it's primarily through the use of first generation anticoagulants. There may be a zinc phosphide label or two out there as well. I'd have to double check on that. And for today's purposes, we're talking about managing rats and mice in agricultural fields. So we're going to not worry about bromethalin and cholecalciferol. We're not going to talk about second generation anticoagulants. We're going to talk exclusively about the first generation anticoagulants. So keep that in mind. Let's start off talking a little bit about how we might utilize first generation anticoagulants to manage voles. These particular products can be applied in one of three methods. Those include spot treatments, broadcast applications, or in bait stations. Spot treatments are where you take a designated amount of bait and you spread it very thinly around a vole burrow entrance or runway. Usually we're talking about several pieces of grain per square foot if that bait is distributed properly. If we look at this photo at the bottom left, we can see an example of where a spot treatment was definitely not applied properly. Admittedly, this is for California ground squirrels, not voles, but I think the photo does a really good job of illustrating how when you pile up bait around burrow entrances, you essentially have just that. It's a pile. When you have a pile of bait, all kinds of animals are able to come along and eat enough of that product to get a lethal dose. So it's very dangerous, a very hazardous situation if you pile up bait like that. But if we apply it like it's like the label requires, and that is just a few pieces of grain per square foot, now there are very few animals adapted to be able to pick up enough of that grain to get a lethal dose, which is why if we follow label specifications, we can utilize this product in a safe manner. But as you can imagine, spot treatments, time-consuming process. If you have more than just a few burrow systems to treat, you might be wondering if there's another option that you can use instead. So another option would be the use of a seed spreader. Here's an example of one that's attached to the back of an ATV, which is calibrated to spread bait out over larger areas at a specified flow rate. So this allows you to treat larger areas much more rapidly while still ensuring that you have only a few pieces of grain per square foot. And then in some settings, you might utilize bait stations for voles as well. Bait stations are designed to keep out species that are larger than the entrance of the burrow system. So we're able to reduce access to the bait to a large extent for a lot of the non-target species. And they can be utilized quite extensively by voles. The problem is, though, is that voles don't travel very far distances. And so you oftentimes have to have a large number of bait stations out there in order to intercept all of the potential voles that may be in a particular area. So for that reason, at least in certain cropping systems, broadcast applications tend to be more practical than the use of these kinds of bait stations. But still, many situations, bait stations might be the only allowable option. And so that's a good tool to have. Just keep in mind, again, these are first generation anticoagulants. They're chronic feed materials. So the animals should have access to the bait over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. And so usually if we're talking about spot treatments or broadcast applications, that means reapplying the bait around 4 days after initial application. Although read the label, it will tell you exactly when you need to do it. And for bait stations, you can't just put them out there and forget about them. You need to make sure that they're maintaining a constant bait supply for this product to work. Now, we also have the acute toxicant zinc phosphide, which can be used for voles as well. Again, it kills after a single feed, but zinc phosphide has a distinct garlicky odor and taste to it that sometimes animals don't necessarily appreciate. And so they might eat 1 or 2 pieces of this grain, then get sick from it, and then not feed on it again. So think back to anthraquinone. It's kind of that learned avoidance type response here. So because of that, zinc phosphide is generally only allowable for use for 1 application per year. In alfalfa, you can actually get away with 2 applications per year for voles, but usually just 1 application per year. And that's so that you don't start to get a population that learns to avoid this product at a higher rate. Also, because of that distinct odor associated with it, we don't generally use it in bait stations. It's usually just used for spot treatments or broadcast applications. And because it's an acutely toxic material, we don't usually use it in or around buildings. In fact, most of the labels, if not all of the labels, require you to be a certain distance away from those kinds of buildings or structures. Now, we can also control rats and mice through the use of rodenticides. Again, emphasizing that today we're focusing on managing rats and mice in ag fields. And I was involved with a study probably about 10 years ago where we looked at elevated bait stations and several different kinds of products to try to manage roof rats in almond orchards. And what we ended up finding out is these elevated bait stations containing 0.005% diphacinone grain were very effective at controlling both roof rats and deer mice. So this seems to be a good option for managing those species. If you're interested a little bit more in the specifications of the bait stations that we use, here you can see the diagram from it. And all of this information is included in a UC A&R publication titled Managing Roof Rats and Deer Mice in Nut and Fruit Orchards. So if you're somebody that has issues with roof rats or deer mice in these kinds of orchard settings, then certainly I encourage you to check out that publication. It's a free PDF. Now, fumigants are occasionally used for the species we're talking about here today, although they're more commonly used for ground squirrels and to some extent for pocket gophers as well. Of the potential fumigant options that are out there, there are gas cartridges. Occasionally, they might be used for roof rats, but realistically, there's probably some better options out there. There's also aluminum phosphide. Common commercial names are phostoxin or fumitoxin or weevilside. Those are some of the more common ones that are out there. These are basically tablets or pellets that you put into a burrow system, which then reacts with moisture within the burrow system to create phosphine, which is toxic to the animal. They're actually used a little bit in artichoke fields because for some reason, voles tend to burrow at deeper depths in artichoke fields than they do in some of the other crops that are out there. And because of that depth, it holds that gas in at a higher rate. And so they've had some success with utilizing aluminum phosphide for voles in artichoke fields. But most fields, the vole burrow systems tend to be too shallow and the openings are too numerous for aluminum phosphide to be a practical tool. And then we also have our pressurized exhaust machines, such as the PERC machine here on the left, and our carbon dioxide injection devices, such as the Eliminator on the right, which are used for burrowing rodents now. Probably more practical for use against ground squirrels and gophers, but again, there may be some limited settings, at least for Norway rats, where they might be a viable option. And then, again, we're talking about ag settings, and so this isn't a relevant option for ag fields, but if you're in some of these commensal type settings, there is rat ice, which is dry ice, which can be used in burrow systems to control burrowing rats. But you have to buy the specific rat ice that's labeled for that use. You can't just go to the grocery store and buy dry ice because that's not labeled as a pesticide. And so this is pretty hard to find, pretty limited in scope as to where it can be used. And so it's probably not something that any of you will be able to use, but I just wanted to mention it quickly. The last item, sometimes people talk about fertility control and if there's any kind of fertility control options available for trying to manage some of these pest species. And when it comes to rats, there actually is. There's ContraPest, which was developed by SenesTech. It's basically a substance that the animal ingests over time, and they can lose the capability of producing offspring. It's been tested in a variety of settings. Sometimes it works okay, sometimes not so well. There continues to be more work on it. I think you'll probably see more and more about it over the years. Just keep in mind that with this particular kind of tool, even if it is really effective at reducing reproduction of these species, you're still going to have to incur some damage for a period of time until the rats die off on their own, so to speak. So you do have to be willing to continue to experience some of that kind of damage longer term. Or shorter term before you get some of the longer term benefits. So realistically, maybe it's more practical for use as part of an IPM program where maybe you knock down a population with a rodenticide and then try to maintain at lower densities with this kind of fertility control. The last thing I'll leave you with on this is, again, it's not really allowable for use in agricultural fields, more so just in residential areas, although it can, I believe, be used around ag buildings, in particular dairies and places like that as well. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation today. So I guess we can now take some questions.
Where could I find the bait station for roof rats?
Oh, such a great question. So I believe that they still might be available from the LA County Ag Commissioner's office. And so you might check there. I'm not 100% certain. We've been hoping to get somebody to carry them, but to date we haven't had much success beyond that. If that's not a potential option, you could always develop something yourself using, standard PVC pipe. Maybe take an end cap and cut it in half and glue it onto that pipe so that you have a substantial lip. Maybe you'd even utilize 3/4 of it if you're going to be placing it at some kind of an angle. Sometimes I've seen folks take end caps and then just cut a hole out of the end cap too. That would be similar to the diameter of what I showed you today. So those are a couple of potential options there that you could look at.
Okay, thanks. One of the questions that came in through the chat was, can you shoot the trapped animal with an air gun legally?
Yes, you can. And so that is considered a humane form of euthanasia. It's just, the openings for the live traps sometimes are pretty narrow for rats. It's more commonly used for ground squirrels or raccoons, skunks, and things along those lines. But yes, if you have the kind of trap and the equipment to be able to shoot the rat, that is considered a humane form of euthanasia, and it is something that can be done.
Okay. One, are secondary poisoning concerns for barn owls?
So you were cutting a little bit, but I think you were asking, are there secondary concerns for poisoning for barn owls?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So potentially, yes. Particularly if we're talking about the first generation anticoagulants or second generation any anticoagulant. So the second generation anticoagulants, which would be, there's a moratorium on their use in the state for most uses, but they can be used in some settings. But those are brodifacoum, bromadiolone, diphenthioulone, and difenacoum. These are the products that have a much greater secondary toxicity risk to non-target species. However, first generation anticoagulants have some secondary toxicity risk as well. So there is that potential. That being said, I've actually been involved in a research project with some students here on campus over the last few years, and they've been looking at exposure of barn owls in fields where anticoagulants have been applied, and they have found extremely low incidence of these anticoagulants showing up in barn owls. Could be for a variety of reasons, but at least based on this particular project, we're not seeing them show up in barn owls. But that being said, yes, you should utilize some caution, at least when trying to combine the tools, to the extent that you can. If you're going to utilize these first generation anticoagulants, you should be searching for dead rodents and removing them from the landscape, so that you don't have that potential secondary toxicity concern. Now, if we're talking about zinc phosphide has actually very low to almost non-existent secondary toxicity risk. So if you wanted to utilize zinc phosphide and have barn owls, then there really isn't much of a risk at all for that kind of combination.
Okay. Would flood irrigation for groundwater recharge be effective timing to mitigate rodent problems?
Potentially. It's actually something that I have thought about, and I've been thinking about trying to put together a project to take a look at that. So I think that there is the potential for real utility for something like that. I do think that managing voles and also gophers, I work a lot with gophers, trying to manage them over the winter months through early spring is a really great time to try to manage those particular species. And so if you could, time a flood irrigation event and, also experience some groundwater recharge, then all the better. So I do think that there may be some potential utility there.
Okay. Where can I find a trap tunnel or box that holds rat traps?
You're just going to have to search online for that. There are several options for that. The one that we used was sold by Matomco, but there are other products out there that are sold by other companies that are likely just as effective. So just, go out there and search online. There may be some sold in some of your farm supply stores as well. It's kind of difficult to keep track of exactly what they're selling at any point in time. I've seen them in there before, and they may be in there now as well.
Okay, just a couple of more here. Does the anticoagulant affect larger animals that may prey on the rodents?
So yeah, just getting, kind of rehashing a little bit of what we discussed already. The anticoagulants do have some secondary toxicity potential. So again, you do have to be cognizant of that and try to remove carcasses to the extent that you can. Again, that said, though, the first generation anticoagulants, which are the ones we use for field rodents, have definitely have a lower risk associated with them than the second generation products, which we can't use for field rodents. So the risk is certainly less with these products than they are with the second gen products, but there is still some potential risk.
All right, and I think just this last one, what vegetable can we plant to prevent rats? And what vegetable do rats not like?
I do not know the answer to that. I don't know that there necessarily is, or there certainly could be, but I don't know that anybody's actually figured that one out yet. So there probably are certain, plants that they like more than others and less than others, but we sometimes hear that there are some kind of plants that we can plant to repel, some of these species, whether it be gophers, voles, etc. And there have been some plants that have been theorized over the years, but really nothing that's ever been proven through a research project that deters them. So yeah, I don't have a good answer on that one, unfortunately.
Okay, and so just I want to thank you for your presentation today. Thank you again, and thank you everybody for attending today.